Hey everyone, Reed here with Big Strong Book, and today we're talking about Herscht 07769 by László Krasznahorkai. So if you guys remember last summer around there, I viewed the Bellatar film Satan Tango and then reviewed Krasznahorkai's novel, which the film was based off of, and which Krasznahorkai himself, along with Bellatar, adapted for the screen. And I really enjoyed it, especially the film, with as I recounted in those reviews, the film itself was 7.5 hours long. Just this brutal kind of freight train coming straight at you of dreary, not I wouldn't say nihilism, but pessimism. Pessimism about a community still at the tail end of the Cold War. The effects of such a living, the gullibility of the citizenry was a big piece of that, and in the webbed theme of Satan Tango was carried on from the book in how it told itself. I'll say how the story presented itself, or how Krasznahorkai presented the story. Now, with that, it was split into, I believe, like 12 or 13 chapters, and Krasznahorkai's quirk, I guess, is, at least it is in two of these novels. I'm not sure if this carries through and is representative of all of his work, but in the Satan Tango, you had unbroken, pretty much each chapter was its own unbroken paragraph. In Herscht 07769, Krasznahorkai takes that a step further. Not only is this entire book one unbroken paragraph, but it is one sentence. That seems insane, certainly, to even attempt such a feat. Now, does this mean that this book is bereft of punctuation? No. There are plenty of commas, semicolons, colons, enough to get in em dashes, enough to give a little bit of reprieve for the reader in the action. But it isn't just, Krasznahorkai did this just to do it. There is intentionality behind this, at least I believe there was some. Now, so this book is, it's either his most recent or his second most recent novel, second to recent. This was published in the original Hungarian in 2021, translated into English and published by New Directions Press last year in 2024. So this is at least his most recent work translated into English. It seems like Krasznahorkai wrote another novel that was published in 2024. I couldn't get a lot of confirmation on that. I couldn't even find the book online anywhere. It hasn't been translated into English yet, but I just looked to see if there was one, and it doesn't seem like there is. So this might be his most recent. Anyways, what is Herscht 07769 about? Well, it follows, as Satan Tango kind of did, these figures in this German town, this time a German town of Kana. The protagonist is a man named Florian Herscht, who, he's a very interesting character. He is obsessed with a lot of scientific or ill-informed scientific inferences that, due to something that began with the Big Bang, that the universe will imminently end. And he spends at least a good chunk of this novel, one of the things he does is he is trying to get into contact with Angela Merkel, the then Chancellor of Germany, to try to warn her to kind of call up the UN Security Council and try to get to the bottom of this and to prevent the world from ending. And he had taken these physics classes with this professor, but of course, he had his eccentricities, and he kind of extrapolated where there weren't things to extrapolate, and he had just assumed that the world was going to end. He is also in the fold with this neo-Nazi gang run by this figure called the Boss. The Boss is a very eccentric figure. Not only is he a vehement neo-Nazi and the leader of this gang, but he is also the head of this amateur orchestra, and his goal is for them to perform works of Bach, but as Krasznahorkai kind of hammers home time and time again, this orchestra seems to be only capable of performing works by the Beatles and pieces of the soundtrack from Game of Thrones. So they are not up to, I guess, the Aryan ideals of the Boss. And the Boss, he takes Florian under his wing, and it seems like he sets him up with a place to live, these kind of like little tasky jobs that Florian does. And Florian is presented in a lot of characters that he interacts with, assume him to be this very dull, gullible, easily made paranoid type of guy, somebody who is easily manipulated. Now, that begs the question, is Florian Krasznahorkai's stand-in for the average European? Because as we know, Europe in general over the past 10, maybe even 15 years, maybe even earlier than that, has seen a rightward shift with the reemergence, as we have seen in the United States as well, the reemergence of far-right or alt-right ideologies, figures, parties, where those far-right ideologies are starting to become more merged with the mainstream. That is certainly within the past, 10 years. It manifested within European figures like the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. Obviously, Krasznahorkai is probably pinpointing that, even though this book is not set in Hungary. Germany is the obvious place, I think, for him to set this, because Germany, and it actually, with what has been happening politically in Germany recently, it kind of makes sense as well. That in the past German cycle of elections, we really saw a rise in these far-right parties that were starting, not neo-Nazi parties necessarily, but knocking on the door of that, that were starting to gain footholds in election cycles. So again, Viktor Orban in France, Marine Le Pen, and the, I think it's called the National Front Party, and then obviously in America with the ascendancy to a second presidency of Trump, and the kind of fringe movements that are kind of lurking in the Republican Party right now in particular. It seems like the average person is kind of more open to extremism, or what were formerly seen as extremist ideologies. Now, again, what does that say about the average person? In this case, the average European. Does this mean that they are gullible for accepting extremist views, or that they are accepting extremist views in the guise of a nostalgia of a past that was never even really there? I think we kind of see that a lot in America. A lot of the kind of more rampant conservative viewpoints seems to be wanting America to get back to kind of this Leave It to Beaverland, this kind of nostalgia for how America was, even though that was never how America really was. But you start to get enough people to believe it, but does that make that non-real nostalgic past into a reality if enough people start to believe it? But then you get into like alternative facts and and fake news and all of that, and then with the emergence of AI, then that takes it. But anyway, I'm rambling. So you have Florian, and he's trying to grasp at straws. He's trying to have balance and a center in his life, and he's easily pulled into these extremist ideologies, but it's, one could even argue that at least for a large portion of this novel, that Herscht himself, that Florian is not I wouldn't say a true believer, but, and even the boss in terms of what he's trying to do, he's trying to, incite the German people to kind of rise up again, to, return things to the way that they were in the 30s, or maybe even to extend that even further. But and again, I'm reminded of when we hear these stories of like these, extremist militia groups that form in the U.S., and maybe Europe has this issue as well. But it's just, these like fat middle-aged men that take it upon themselves to try to like create this militia to beat back against injustice, and to hold the line for in case this type of greater armed conflict breaks out. But of course that greater armed conflict never does break out. So do they have a nostalgia for war even? That's kind of a twisted point that I think a lot of humanity kind of veers into. You become bereft of war for a while, to the point where then you start to yearn for it. But what exactly in it do you yearn for? The bloodlust? Do you yearn for a war economy in which more people can be employed? Or is it, what do you yearn for in that? Yeah. Do you yearn for the kill, or do you yearn for the result of the kill? So we have the boss, and but what the boss, one thing that the boss is fixated on, again, as I mentioned with his orchestra, he is fixated on Johann Sebastian Bach, obviously one of the greatest composers of all time, but Bach in this particular case seems to, with this group, but in particular with the boss, Bach is the standard bearer for this kind of German idealism that needs to make a return, and he wants to kind of bring that to the fore with his orchestra. And in a lot of the portions of this book, I mean, the boss literally just kind of beats a timpani in the orchestra. He doesn't even have the requisite skill to be a woodwind or a brass or a string player, or he doesn't have the desire. He just wants to kind of beat the shit out of some drums. And again, because he's kind of a hardliner. But what starts to happen is that these Bach statues, landmarks, they start to become defaced with graffiti with these groups that have this wolf emblem or wolf moniker. And then eventually literal wolves, start to make their way into this town and start to kind of attack the citizens. Now, again, Krasznahorkai's absolute strength is in the relentlessness with which he kind of forces his narrative in front of the reader, by never taking his foot off the brake, really ever. Obviously, this book is meant to be just one continuous sentence. But then with what transpires eventually within this novel, then you start to observe it within the context of just one single sentence about how things can change for the characters, how things just literally happen instantaneously. He has a lot of just like random about faces with characters and things that happen in their lives. But then he also is very interested in the about faces that humans, that his characters, but also that humans can make, in terms of identity, and then the forward-facing identity that people assume, or even something that can be true one minute is then no longer true the next minute, but yet it's the same person altogether, particularly with things that happen to Florian throughout this book, which again is fascinating. And for a while, I was wondering where Krasznahorkai, where he was taking this. This is a very different work from Satan Tango, but yet that kind of, I think the pessimism that is rooted in this, it makes it because this is a social novel, but it's not even like Krasznahorkai, I think, has social intentions with this book. Maybe that's too naive of me to say that he doesn't have intentions. I don't think he does. I think he is curious and trying to get to the heart of the social bends towards extremism in the world, and I mean, ultimately what Krasznahorkai comes up with is just a big fat question mark, which is, why do people feel the pull towards these? Well, it's a question mark, not only in what we can perceive outside looking into what draws somebody into extremism, but also that there's a big question mark for the people that are drawn into extremism as well, because they're pulled towards a question mark, towards, again, an idealism that has never really been there. Florian then he gets pulled into the boss's sphere of influence even more when he gets hooked on Bach, and starts listening to it just over and over again. And that becomes kind of a center for him, that he can feel at ease, and that he feels that, like, that Bach, there's even a point in this book where he feels that Bach not only is the standard bearer, but he's also, his works contain no evil. His works contain a sort of purity within them. Florian is looking for purity, and he's looking for order, because again, he thinks that in some sort of study of quantum physics that he's done, there is some sort of inherent disorder and chaos that is in the quantum realm that will slowly lead to the end of our own atomic realm. And he is obsessed with just, again, finding this order, finding this purity. And this novel, I think, for me at least, it really kicks into high gear. It really kicks into high gear in the last, I would say, a quarter. This is a little over 400 pages long, but it really kicks into high gear in the last 100, I'd say, where Florian kind of takes a significant, a brutal leap. Meanwhile, we're seeing kind of the effects of this community sort of bend and twist. We see things happen to, I think, Coring is his name, the professor, and in what transpires for a while, that there's like this kind of, there's a mundane quality to this town. The boss has a need for violent terrorist attacks to happen. He has a desire for this. And then things start to change. I think it's in the December month in this book when, and I'll be diving into spoilers, but I even feel like spoiling what happens, it doesn't detract from the effect that this book will have. But anyway, spoilers from here on out. So the gas station attack that ends up leaving a couple people dead, and a more intense scrutiny into this neo-Nazi gang, and then the boss ends up dead. Now, what's interesting, I feel like maybe I didn't catch it, because again, when you're kind of getting through this unbroken sentence of a book, your eyes just start to glaze over, and then like a couple pages later, I would find myself just kind of like locking back into the text. So the boss is murdered, and it's not clear necessarily who did it. I don't think it's abundantly clear who did it. It could have been Florian, but then it doesn't really make sense that Florian did it, because of how he just latches on to the boss after his death and then goes out on this like vengeance, whether it's vengeance or whether it's trying to shore up everything within the group. But what is Florian trying to do? I mean, he's so bent out. I think nobody is heeding him. And when he's confronted with violence, when this kind of status quo is then interrupted by a violent act with this gas station attack, then all of a sudden he just spirals, but he spirals to the nth degree. He becomes an unambiguous extremist when he tried. Then he just, but it's not like he's an extremist for a cause. He's an extremist for himself in terms of trying to pick off everybody within this group. And there's another person, Karen, in the group, and she's trying to do the same thing as well. And there's a lot of obvious symmetry in symbolism and metaphors, especially when there's the fire, like the Karen and Florian are kind of getting close to getting at one another, and there's this eagle, of course, that is taken down, and of course you think the eagle, Nazi iconography, with that, and it's kind of this half alive but dying eagle that's on the ground. Yeah, Krasznahorkai kind of pinpointing even further what all is going on. And then you have as the orchestra lends their performance, and it just becomes this kind of drunken bash, a kind of half-assery for nationalist pride. I even think that they get into a German, let me look back on this, a kind of German collective song, and again, they can't recall. It says they can't recall the next verses of this dear little ditty from the old times, and maybe the repetition did them good as well, because they were singing, they sat hunched over, banging their steins on the table. By the end, they were yelling so that nobody could complain about the atmosphere, and there were no complaints until the early afternoon. So this kind of collective morose, and they're half doing this kind of in a drunken stupor, but as Florian in a drunken stupor as well, almost, as he becomes this kind of vagabond with a vengeance, leading on towards the end. And then, of course, the irony in all of this is all of a sudden, again, the title of the book, Herscht 07769, the letters that he's sending to Merkel, all of a sudden towards the end of the book, but he's nowhere near to see it. A letter comes back to him from Angela Merkel. But then when you get all of these characters that all of a sudden die in the town and die these brutal deaths, it's, they're hanging on to themselves. And it's right at the time that Frau Ringer, that she comes into contact with another one of her old friends. So as she unlocks this nostalgic bend, then all of a sudden everything goes to hell for her. And then the wolves come back, and then it's revealed that this wolf tagging group, it seems like they're just a bunch of environmentalists and preservers who want to protect the wolves, and it's not like they had a vendetta necessarily against the neo-Nazis. And then with Florian kind of dying at the end just by these wolves, and I loved the ending of this, when he's by the wolves, and it's just the three of them, that they are the Bach psalm suddenly stopped playing in Florian's head. The pain and the dizziness made him close his eyes, and then he understood that in reality the wolves were not looking at anything but listening, kind of as Florian had done. Just as he too was listening from this point on. And from this point on, all three of them would be listening blindly and forever to the peaceful, tinkling, sweet gurgling of the water, a few steps away from them in the merciless night descending heavily upon the land, which kind of leads into, a lot of this takes place around May Day, I think, a period of rebirth. Now, as Krasznahorkai is saying, that with this rebirth happening and kind of the disintegration of the neo-Nazi group, that he's taking a bend that this extremism will go away. Yeah, I don't think so, because there is still there's ambiguity with Florian at the end, and that May Day, this period of rebirth around this time, also leads to the brutal random deaths of people in the town. So that, good old Krasznahorkai bend of chaos kind of ruling the day, and the seasons kind of continue on without a care for the whims of everybody trying to look again for that centering, for that peace that will ground them so they don't feel adrift anymore. They will continue to feel adrift as long as they keep searching for those ideals that don't exist and don't have, I think, any concrete application within their lives that can continue on for quite some time. So, again, that's very long-winded, and I could be well off the mark with a lot of things with the book. Anyway, Herscht 07769 by László Krasznahorkai, the master. If you have read it, let me know what you think of it, and as always, I will see you guys next time.